vernacular means indigenous or a domestic language. Unlike the lesser-known languages, Latin was not considered as much of a vernacular as like Italian or English or Spanish. It was considered a far superior language.
Hello, I'm Grace Jensen, and my partner Thomas will be talking about what were the benefits of a shared language for education. What were the advantages and disadvantages of the loss of Latin as a language for education and changing to the language of the writer? Tell us about how Charlemagne influenced the communities of knowledge. So, first point is Charlemagne himself. He lived 742 to 814. Overall, normally thought of as kind of a textbook figure. You think of him in kind of a school aspect, but like what's his practical application today? He was crowned Roman Emperor Christmas Day of 1800. However, he was mostly known as the reformer of the Latin language and the Roman alphabet. He was king during 768 through on the rest of his reign, where he conquered the Saxons and organized an empire of Italy, France, and modern Germany. But overall, his most prominent discovery and thing he had a issue with was the decay of Christian learning. He was eventually persuaded the English monk Alcuin to organize a reform of language and education in turn to correct the language of script. He said the original and correct language of scripture was Latin. So, in his quote, in each bishopric and each monastery, let the psalms, notes, the chants, and the calculations, and the grammar be taught and carefully corrected in the correct language of Latin.
Before Charlemagne came along and decided that everything had to be in Latin, different scholars from different countries like Spain, Italy, France, they couldn't talk, they couldn't share ideas, they couldn't share hypotheses, theorems, or scientific laws they had discovered. So when Charlemagne came and decided that everything should be in Latin, it might have been tyrannical. I mean, you might have considered it really bad for the country. But if that wouldn't have happened, we wouldn't have had nearly as many scientific discoveries as we have today, because everything would be in different languages, and then we wouldn't get it. Like everything that was in China and Japan, like we didn't really apply any of their discoveries because they were in a different language and we couldn't understand them, or to a certain extent there was the break off of they speak a different language, so we can't understand everything they're saying. And also Latin was considered a superior language. It was much more, people would say back then it was much more advanced language than the common folk languages of like Italian and it was also created by the Romans, which in that time they were still considering the Romans like the greatest empire in Europe. Even though it was already gone, they were still speaking their language.
Yeah. So, in turn, Charlemagne, as the king of Rome, had such a heavy impact over that. He was able to persuade most of the commonplace that Latin was the language that they should use for education purposes specifically, but as you can see nowadays, that is worn off. One of the big losses we got from that, when the common language was Latin for education, you had a very clear understanding of how everything was supposed to be said and the exact words that the author said to use them. Nowadays, when we have to translate it from the original text to our languages or the language of the writer, it becomes an issue due to mistranslations and a lack of properly worded phrases. So we don't necessarily always get the proper intent of what the author was saying.
Yeah. And also in science, especially with like the classification of living things, everything will be classified in its Latin name, which would just describe what it is. Like plant uses the Latin word for green living thing or something like that. So when everyone spoke Latin, it wasn't just it's this weird Latin word that's used to describe it. No, that knows exactly what it means. So I can see that in the classification of living things and know, well, it's just, they're describing it right here. The word that they used to name it is also the description for it. And so with Latin, everyone knowing Latin, everyone speaking the communal scientific language of Latin, you could all understand all of the things in like biology and like chemistry and such.
So, in conclusion, it's a devastating loss that we no longer have Latin as our universal language of education. And would love to get back to those days.
But to that point, since Latin has been depleted, it nullifies the reason for learning it anymore.